All right, folks. I think that we can just go ahead and probably get started then. Um, I'm so glad that lots of folks come out tonight for our latest trans topics on trans travel considerations. My name is Robin. I'm the development coordinator here at Eastern PA Trans Equity Project, and I use any pronouns. I'll be monitoring the chat, so if you have questions throughout the presentation, I'll be looking at the chat to help Rachel be able to see them. And if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to message me specifically, and I can try to my best to help resolve those. Um, but just to kick things off, for folks who maybe aren't aware of all of our services, Eastern PA Trans Equity Project, we are an organization that is centered around helping trans folks thrive. We build community, empower trans folks, and try to promote justice in our area. We serve 42 counties, so all the way out where I am in the Lehigh Valley, all the way out to State College in the middle of the state. We serve about a population of about 7.5 million, which is about 60% of PA's population. So we get pretty far. We do a whole bunch of different stuff. A lot of folks interact with one or two of our different services, but we do everything from support groups to legal name change assistance, special recognition days like Trans Day of Visibility, Trans Day of Remembrance, a whole bunch of different kinds of pride programs. We do these trans topics workshops to help educate our community on topics that matter to us. And we do a lot of basic needs grants too. So things like rent, utilities, food assistance. Basically, we're trying to do everything we can to remove barriers so that trans folks can thrive. So that's a little bit of a snapshot of Eastern PA Trans Equity Project. We serve about a little over 6,000 people a year. And yeah, so thanks for joining with our this trans topics episode. And I'm super happy to turn things over to our speaker for tonight, which is Rachel Levy, who is part of Jerner Law. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let her share hers.
And thank you. And then we're going to do the fun part where I'm definitely going to get this right on the first time.
I believe in you.
And can we all see a PowerPoint? That is super exciting.
Yes.
Okay. So, hello. Welcome to today's topic. So, we are going to be talking about trans travel concerns. So, I also apologize. You're going to see my little cursor going. Nothing I can do. You're just going to see me gesturing a whole bunch. So, for who I am, my name is Rachel Levy. I am an associate at Jerner Law Group. We are an LGBT family law firm. We are based in Philly, but we serve most of the surrounding counties. We also serve New Jersey as well. Though for today, we're really just going to be talking about federal and Pennsylvania specific documents. So for Jerner Law, we do a whole bunch of types of family law, specifically catering to the LGBT community. So our practice areas include adoption, assisted reproduction law, estate planning, domestic relations, name changes, estate administration, updating documents. I do about half the things on that list, and I have a bunch of really talented colleagues that do the other half. So we like to consider ourselves a one-stop shop for LGBT legal needs specifically. So we cover a pretty wide ground. One of the big things that we do cover is the legal name change process and the process that comes after, which is updating documents and having accurate identity documents after a name change process, or just as part of a transition in general. So for the topics we're going to be talking about today, first, we're going to be talking about travel documents themselves. What are they? What are the biggest ones that are going to be coming up for people? And what are the ones to keep an eye on? Getting into that, we're going to talk a lot about passports. If I'm being honest with you all, that is most of what we're going to be talking about. Because truthfully, that is what has the most confusion right now with a lot of the federal rules that are changing very quickly and without a ton of notice. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the passport policy that you may have seen in headlines. We're going to talk about the litigation that's going on to affect the passport policy. And we're going to talk about the Supreme Court decision that came out in November and what that actually means and what that will actually have an impact on and who that affects. The last part we're going to talk about is traveling safely while trans. And this is going to cover a lot of ground. Truthfully, for this section, we're going to be covering a lot of the commonly asked questions that I see a lot in my day-to-day. And then at the end, we're also going to have a Q&A, and that is for anyone who is joining us live during this talk. Send in your questions, and we're going to cover most of them at the end. If we can cover them during the talk, I will try to. For the most part, I'm going to be covering any of those at the end of our conversation. And for anyone who's joining us when this is eventually uploaded to YouTube or another website, you do not unfortunately get to send me questions. I am so sorry about that. So, the other big thing to talk about is what we are not talking about tonight. So, two big topics I want to flag that aren't going to be in our conversation. The first one is the current state of gender affirming care. The reason I bring that up, it does have a ton of overlap when it comes to the reasons that trans people need to travel around the United States, either domestically or internationally. We're not going to talk specifically about the current laws about gender affirming care, either in Pennsylvania or nationally, though you are going to hear that topic come up a little bit, the way it intersects with other things. The other big one I want to talk about is immigration law. We will not be handling questions about emigrating to other countries out of the United States. There are a lot of attorneys who can talk a lot more better about that than I can. And also not necessarily me talking about people who are trying to immigrate into the United States. Specifically, these are for people who are trying to just travel in and out of the United States, whether that is within the borders for domestic travel or for international. And the last big thing that I have to say, because I am a lawyer, none of this is specific legal advice. Everything I'm going to be talking about, this is general information. None of this is meant to apply to a specific person or situation. And so a lot of times a lawyer's answer when you ask a more specific question is it depends. It always depends on different factors going on for different people. So just as a heads up, a lot of this information might depend on you specifically. It might depend a little bit on your, I am so sorry, might depend on your situation. And so if you'd like, you can always reach out to my office. We can talk more one-on-one. For the most part, this is going to be an information session. So with all that said, what's the first thing we're going to talk about? We're going to start talking about travel documents. So the big one I want to talk about, really my stance for our conversation tonight is breaking things into happier topics and more complicated topics. Real IDs is a happier topic, and this is one I don't think a ton of people know about, though we have by now heard about real IDs. You've probably seen the signs that have been posted telling you to get one. So a real ID is a state-issued ID. A good way to think of it, this is almost like an enhanced driver's license. It's issued by your state DMV or Department of Motor Vehicles. This is not a federal document. Real IDs are interesting because they do have federal meaning. As of May of this year, they are required, or having a Real ID compliant ID is required to travel domestically or to fly domestically in the United States. But just because it has federal meaning, it's a state issued document, which means the federal government doesn't decide the rules for real IDs. That is set by the issuing state itself. So here, that's set by Pennsylvania. So in Pennsylvania, and also as a spoiler for New Jersey, the rules are very similar. Real ID gender markers are updated by self-attestation. I also want to take a step back. So just as a highlight for all the documents we're going to be talking about, when it comes to trans people's travel documents specifically, there are two big things that you might want to think about updating. The first is going to be your legal name, and that is going to be after you've gone through the legal name change process and you get a court order with your new legal name and updating the name on your travel document. That is a little bit different because you should update your name on everything. And that is a whole other conversation and a little bit more in depth about making sure you have your documents updated. We'll also be touching on that for other topics as well. The other big piece is updating your gender marker. Your gender marker is going to be on most of your personal IDs or photo IDs, the things that you use to identify yourself when you have to. And so when it comes to the gender markers on your real ID, that is set at the state level, not the federal level. So in Pennsylvania, that's set by self-attestation, meaning however you want to have the marker set is how it will be set. In both PA and New Jersey, you have the options of an F, M, or X, and all you do is you go in person to your DMV office and you check a box on the form indicating what you want your gender marker to be. That's it. There's no extra requirements. There's nothing else hidden. Sometimes different DMVs, depending on what you're doing, if you are upgrading to a real ID, renewing your license, anything like that, they might have an extra document you need to give them, like proof of address or proof of citizenship, something like a social security card, different things like that. But for the most part, when it comes to your gender marker, it's checking off a box on the form. That's about all it takes. The other big thing, and we're circling back to this, travelers need real ID compliant IDs for domestic flights as of May of this year. I know we have also most likely heard about that they might be charging money for you to opt out of having a real ID. I would encourage you to just get a real ID. You do not need to give them $20 or whatever it is to not, I don't know. get a real ID. I will say, there's not many takeaways from tonight's conversation. One of them is get a real ID. It is very helpful to avoid a lot of other issues that can come up in travel documents. It's really helpful when it comes to domestic travel and to making sure that you have a document with your correct gender marker on it, regardless of anything else. But you can use other IDs that are Real ID compliant. So those can also include a US passport, which you're going to see on the next slide. Either the book or a passport card, either is totally fine. You can also use a state issued enhanced driver's license or enhanced ID. In Pennsylvania, we don't have those, but for anyone who might be listening in from, and I'm so sorry if I get it wrong, I believe New York, Vermont, all the places kind of close to Canada, a lot of those states are going to be eligible for an enhanced ID, and that is kind of a middle ground. It's going to be your regular driver's license with a little bit of an extra bump to it. That's a document that usually allows people to cross the border to Canada, for example. That also counts. A global entry card also counts. If you work for the Department of Defense, your ID there also counts. Nice perk. And if you are a permanent resident, your green card is also going to count for purposes of a real ID. All those things count. All those things are in the same boat. But a real ID itself, issued by the state, you can have any gender marker on it that you want. And so I said we were going to split tonight. We're talking about happier topics and more complicated topics. And so our first more complicated topic, let's start talking about passports. So compared to real IDs, passports are federally issued documents. They are regulated specifically by the State Department. They're not regulated by the state itself. They are required for international travel, and they are real ID compliant for purposes of domestic travel. So same thing we were talking about before. You can use your passport to fly from Pennsylvania to Wyoming. You could also use a real ID or a passport, either of those things. The tricky part, as a lot of you may have already heard, is that updating gender IDs or gender markers on federal IDs is a lot more complicated. Generally for federal IDs and for federal information, after the Trump administration's executive order earlier this year, which I got a lot of thoughts on, but after the executive order earlier this year, the policy of many federal agencies is that there is a pause on the ability to update gender markers. The biggest places where there is just a flat pause in place is Social Security. That's one of the bigger ones where it can come up, though it's not relevant for tonight's conversation. That is still a big topic to talk about. Also comes up for things like global entry, consular reports of birth abroad. That's for anyone who had a birth abroad and is trying to register it, and naturalization certificates. For all those kinds of documents at this time, and I really do want to emphasize at this time, there is a pause on the ability to update those gender markers. Policies change, and I am optimistic they're going to change in the future. The pause is in place for right now. And for all of those documents, that's essentially the end of that conversation. There is a pause in place, and we're not sure when it will change or if it will change in the future. It's going to depend a lot on kind of what the law looks like, which we will also talk a little bit more about. The real reason I want to talk about this is in the context of passports. This is a lot more complicated. So prior to January of this year, the passport policy, so the official policy of the US State Department, is that gender markers were set by self-attestation, same as they are for real IDs in Pennsylvania. So anyone can choose the gender marker that they are most comfortable having on their passport, and you had the option of F, M, or X. And just to say also for anyone who's unfamiliar, X is considered either the non-binary marker or undesignated. It's for someone who doesn't want to adhere to either an F or an M. You'd like to have a different option instead. And so prior to January of this year, all three of those options were available, and you can decide freely which one you want. As of January of this year, the State Department instituted a new policy, and I'm going to just keep calling that the passport policy or the policy. So the passport policy is that it is the position of the State Department that passports should reflect an individual's sex assigned at birth and not their correct gender, meaning that it should reflect only the sex you were assigned at birth, meaning only either F or M, no longer set by self-attestation, but set based solely on what the State Department believes to be your sex assigned at birth. There's a lot of issues with that policy. There are a lot of complications with that policy. And the biggest thing I also want to add is this policy applies to all passports. This applies to new applications for passports, renewed applications, meaning you are someone who already has a valid passport and you apply to renew your passport. And this also applies for someone who is applying to update or correct information on their passport, And the really big place where that comes up is someone who is going through the legal name change process. If you submit your passport for renewal, essentially, because you're updating information on it, one of the things that can happen is this policy being enforced and your passport being given back to you reflecting a different gender marker than it had when it was issued or when it was provided to the State Department. And same thing as before, under this policy, the only markers that are possible are F or M. X has been removed as an option. So we're going to take a beat. That's a lot of information, and that's a big change to the way that the State Department was doing things. Because it is such a big change, there is obviously a lot of discussion about it. So the next big thing to talk about is the litigation. So for this, I'm going to give really brief overview, and then I'm going to unpack it a little bit more. So to go over what you're seeing on the screen first. So there are two cases that were filed to challenge the passport policy. The first one that was filed in February of this year was filed by the ACLU of Massachusetts, and the private firm Covington and Burling LLP. That case is Orr v. Trump, and that is, if you are someone who's been reading the headlines about passports and gender markers, that's the case that is going to sound a little familiar. So this case at this point has a pretty complicated history to it. The long story short, or to give the brief overview, this case is still happening. The case has not ended. It has not been decided. Really what's been going on is we are in the beginning part of a case. So to talk more about this, we're gonna do a little bit of legal basics. So for cases like this, where we are suing because a policy is harmful, it's going to hurt people, and it has an impact on real people, one of the forms of relief that you can ask for is what's called a preliminary injunction. This is asking the court to say, while the case is being decided, the case is not over, we are going to be litigating this for the future. While the case is being litigated, this policy is going to go into effect. It's going to harm me irreversibly. Please do not put the policy into effect while we're deciding if the policy is lawful. And the lower court granted that relief. It also did a second thing that we don't have to talk as much about. It granted class certification. And so what that means is you have a specific number of people. I think for this case, it was about 7 people who are the named plaintiffs who filed the lawsuit. And so initially that temporary relief, preliminary injunction, but we're just going to call it temporary relief, only applied to those 7 people. The court then granted class certification, which means actually, I don't think it just applies to these 7 people. I think you represent the broader class of transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex people who are going to be harmed by this policy. And in doing that, that temporary relief applies pretty widely. It meant that it applied to any eligible applicant, and there were terms for eligibility, who wanted to have a passport with the correct gender marker listed for them and wanted an exception to the passport policy, or really wanted a passport that correctly reflected who they are. That relief was then appealed to the next higher court, to the circuit court. That court agreed and said the policy does not go into effect. And then that was appealed again to the Supreme Court through something that you also may have heard referred to as the shadow docket. The shadow docket for the Supreme Court, it has a very scary name. A little fitting, if I'm being honest. The shadow docket is a way for cases to get to the Supreme Court that are not on the merits, meaning the value or the importance of the case isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about a very specific procedural part, or we're talking about a very small part of a case. And I also say that to really emphasize the case is not over. The Supreme Court did reverse that temporary relief, meaning they took it away. We had a window of time where there was relief, that window closed. The case is not over. Decisions have not been made. The fight's not over. The relief for the time being is. And so there was a time period where we had an exception to the policy. That exception is no longer in effect. And so we're back to that policy being enforced. And the other case that was filed is a little more interesting because it's a little more new. So we also have Schlachter versus U.S. Department of State. This was a case filed by Lambda Legal in April of this year. And this case is a little bit behind procedurally. And what I mean by that is there are 7 plaintiffs for this case. The court, because of a very technical issue that we do not have time for this evening, the court granted relief to 6 of the 7 plaintiffs in the same way that they were able to get passports reflecting the correct gender marker for them. This case has not gone through the same kind of processes that Orr v. Trump has gone through. It hasn't gotten to class certification, hasn't gotten through these appeals. It's not at the same place that that other case was. And I say that to say there's always an opportunity that that window of temporary relief where that the passport policy is not being enforced can open again. We don't know what it looks like. It depends on a bunch of different factors, including the way judges decide, the strategy that these lawyers decide to use in these cases, what they think is the best move for making sure this policy is out as quickly as possible. And so, with that said, you have one case that's kind of gearing up and one case that's now gearing up not for that temporary relief window, but for trial, for the merits of the case, to hear the whole thing. And so, with that, the litigation right now is ongoing, but doesn't necessarily change the policy itself. So, for the time being, the policy is in effect. So, with that, the next few slides are going to be kind of the commonly asked questions that I get all the time about passports. If any of these, throw any questions you've got in the Q&A section so we can talk about it later, but to cover different situations of what it looks like right now to access a passport. So, for the first one, what will happen if a transgender, gender nonconforming, or intersex person is applying for a passport for the first time? So, this answer is a little bit, it depends. But in general, under the passport policy, it is the position of the State Department that someone's passport should reflect their sex assigned at birth, not their correct gender marker. And so they are going to take efforts to confirm what someone's sex assigned at birth is. There are a few different ways that they can do this. And so some of them are simpler. A lot of those include looking at the documents that you submit. And so for a lot of times that is, for example, you submit a birth certificate as part of your passport application. They might check to see what sex or gender marker is listed for you on your birth certificate. For some people who have recently updated their birth certificates, spoiler, in Pennsylvania, also very easy to do. Not super easy, but like pretty easy. For anyone who has recently updated the gender marker on their birth certificate, I have had anecdotal reports of people who were told that the issue date of their birth certificate was too recent, and that was a suspicion, that made the agent reviewing their application suspicious that they had gotten an update to their birth certificate. So they are reading documents closely. The other big thing that is happening is that federal agencies are talking to each other in a way that they didn't used to. And I will also say, not in a particularly unique way. It is a scary way, but it's not particularly different, but more than they used to. And so one of the things that they're doing is checking with each other. And so that also means that, for example, Social Security is not currently able to be updated. If your gender marker is set a certain way with Social Security, or maybe you did change it, but there is a record of what the first gender marker associated with your account is, that kind of thing, the State Department can use that information. The other big place it pops up is selective service. This really only affects, I shouldn't say only, it does affect a lot of people. This affects specifically anyone who is assigned male at birth between the ages of 18 and 25. It can also affect anyone who identifies as male now, whether that is because you are a trans man, trans masculine, a non-binary person who prefers a male marker, any of those things. If you're someone who is kind of implicated in the scheme of selective service, which again, we don't have time for, but there is a whole situation to talk about when it comes to selective service. But if you are someone who needs to get, for example, an exemption letter for serving in selective service because you were not assigned male at birth, that is another way that they have access to your information, which selective service always has access to. That isn't the particularly scary or interesting thing. The interesting thing is the talking and the communicating to each other about what information they have stored, not necessarily going out and getting new information, just confirming to each other the information they have. That is a bit more insidious than what used to happen. And so that is what makes it a bit trickier. I say all this to say, to give you the actual short answer. If you are someone who's applying for a passport for the first time, there is a chance that you will get a document back with your correct gender marker. There is a bigger chance that you're going to get a document back with your sex assigned at birth, even if that's not the information that you provided. So with that, we go to our next question. What will happen if I've previously updated the gender marker on my passport and then I applied to renew it? And so for this policy, same thing as I said before, it applies to all passports. Doesn't matter if it's a renewal or a new one for the first time. When you apply to renew your passport, they're going to look at the supporting documents you have. They might check the application you originally submitted. I have also anecdotally heard that part of what was used was confirmation that someone had updated their gender marker in the past and just going back to the gender marker before they changed it. Same thing, not accessing new information. This isn't the accessing the information isn't the scary bit. The scary bit for me is the going in and changing information that wasn't asked to be changed. They're not doing that with anything particularly interesting. They're just doing it with the information they have, which is not information, in my opinion, they should be using. But that is also a separate problem, and that gets to the whole issue with the policy itself. So, in this situation where you're submitting your passport for renewal, it is very likely that whoever is processing your application is going to alter your gender marker. It'll be returned back to you, reflecting your sex assigned at birth, not your correct gender marker or the gender marker it had when you sent it in for renewal. For our next question, I updated my gender marker before I legally changed my name. What happens when I try to update my name on my passport? We're going to take a beat for this one. So, everything I said before still applies. So when you apply to update your name on your passport, this is going to be treated like renewing your passport. And so that means the same situation. They are going to be trying to confirm your sex assigned at birth and potentially changing it. And so this now opens up any trans person who is going through the name change process, which very often, again, as an aside, and for something a lot of people already know, the name change process and the process for updating gender markers are very linked because they are usually the same process. It's the same application form where you're going to write your new legal name as you would have also written what your correct gender marker should be. So many people are going to try to do both these things at the same time. And for people who did update their gender markers before, they did that knowing policies like this would come into place, and it's now time to update their name. So now you are put into a horrible situation where you have to decide between two options, neither of which are good or perfect. You can either have a passport reflecting your old legal name and your correct gender marker, or you can have a passport that reflects your correct legal name, but your incorrect gender marker. So in that situation, you have a few options. For a lot of people, they might decide to go forward. And truly, for this, I will say the legal answer I have is always it depends. But genuinely, for this situation, it depends on what makes you feel more comfortable. There is no correct option here. We are working with the tools that we have to keep ourselves safe. And that means making a decision between two not very good options. So a lot of people will decide to go ahead and renew their passport, update their legal name, and have their passport reflect their current legal name, meaning that new name that they've officially changed to. Or a lot of people will decide to wait. And same thing anecdotally, I know a lot of people who've made the decision to wait because they don't want to change their gender marker. They'd rather have incorrect name, correct gender marker on their document. And so for that situation, I want to say first, that's okay. You are absolutely allowed to wait to update your passport. There is nothing wrong with doing that. There are a lot of reasons someone travels with an old legal name on their passport. The biggest example is someone who gets married. And so you have a passport with your maiden name on it and you haven't updated to your married name. People travel that way all the time. Having a passport with an old legal name is not in and of itself the issue. The issue is inconsistencies that can come up, especially if the only document you haven't changed is your passport. So if you are someone who is deciding to wait to update your passport because you do not want to send it in for renewal, you do not want to be subject to the policy, and you would like to keep your valid passport with you for the time being, that is completely fine. There are two things I strongly encourage you to keep in mind. So for those two things, the first one is make sure that you are booking your travel accommodations. And when I say that, I really mean your plane ticket. I mean the actual travel ticket you're using under the name listed on your passport, not your legal name. And so I'm going to repeat this again. If you are traveling and you're using a passport that you've chosen not to update your name because you do not want to submit it, make sure you are booking your ticket and your accommodations under the name on your actual document, not the name you've legally changed to. The most important thing here is making sure your ticket matches your document. That is the main thing that someone like Border Patrol or TSA are going to be looking for when you were going through airport security and when you were checking into your flight. And the second thing is make sure to carry a certified copy of your name change order or the other thing that changes your name. The other, again, we don't have time for it tonight. The other documents that can come up, your name change order, your marriage certificate, your adoption decree, whatever it was that you, by court order, change your name, or by official document, change your name. Carry a certified copy of it when you are traveling. That way, if someone does question you about having a different name on your passport, you can prove that your passport belongs to you. Name change orders or any of these documents, they function like what we call a one and the same order. It shows that you are legally the same person, that both of these names belong to you. And that's how we know that that document is yours. It's not often, if I'm being honest, I've actually never heard of anyone having to use their certified copy when they travel. It's one of those things where I hope no one ever has to use it. I hope that no one ever asks you about it. How often when you fly do you need to show two forms of photo ID? It's not super common, so it's not expected. And that's also why we carry it, is it isn't expected. You don't know when an inconsistency can show up in case you have both IDs out at the same time and someone's not sure why you have two different names listed. Make sure you carry a certified copy with you just in case, so you can show this is my passport, this is my document. And you can say, I got a legal name change. I didn't get around to updating it yet. That happens to people all the time. That happens to cisgender people and transgender people all of the time. So that in and of itself is not the issue. And the last thing I want to say, I think there might be another question after this. I do not remember. So the last thing I want to say is for the situation of I want a gender marker on my passport that's different than my sex assigned at birth. Can I write a different marker on my application? Can I write what I really want to write down? And the answer there is no, for a bunch of reasons. So the first big thing I want to say is make sure when you are filling out federal forms, you're answering the question that's asked. There are some forms where maybe you could get away with writing what the correct answer should be, what your gender marker is. But for the passport forms, the question is specifically, what is your sex assigned at birth? And it's really important that you're answering the question that is asked. Not answering the question honestly can lead to consequences. And again, this is not my way of saying this happens to everyone. Most often what happens when you have false information on a federal form, most often you'll have an agent reach out to you and say, hey, the information on this form didn't match up. Did you want to change your answer? That is not my way of saying try it and see what happens. Please do not try it and see what happens. There are consequences to reporting false information on a federal form. They are not worth the outcome. They are not. The other thing I want to say is even if you are someone who doesn't believe me and you think, no, I definitely think I could get away with it. That is also hard because of everything we talked about before. Federal agencies are talking to each other in ways they didn't used to. And same thing, they're not getting new or different information. They're not surveilling, they're not getting information they didn't already have access to, but they are talking to each other. And it's for the same thing as if you write something different down on your form, even if you say, I'm willing to take the consequences and willing to see what happens. It also doesn't necessarily matter in that way for the same reason that they are reading documents closely, they are cross-checking information. Do not put yourself in a position of consequences when you don't have to, especially for something like this, especially in a situation like this. Don't do it. But again, none of it's legal advice. Do I have another one? I do have another one. I was lying. So I previously updated my gender marker on my passport. Can I still use it? So this is for someone specifically. I did not write this question very well. If I am someone who I updated my gender marker before, let's say November 2024 or even January 2025, I have a validly issued passport with my correct gender marker on it. Can I use it? Yes. Yes, you absolutely can. That passport was validly issued. It is going to be valid until it expires, or at least it should be valid until it expires. The other big thing I want to say is all passports fall into that category, including passports with an X gender marker on them. You cannot now get a passport with an X gender marker, but if you already have one, if you have one that was issued before December 2020 or January 2025, this is December 2025. If you have a passport that was issued before January 2025, you are good. That is valid until it expires. That's the end of that conversation. And I lied again. I knew I had another one. So my passport has an X gender marker. Can I use it? And are there any concerns to using it? And the long story short here is yes, you can use it. There is nothing wrong with using a passport with an X gender marker. I also want to say that to say there's a lot of reasons someone might be uncomfortable now using a passport with an X gender marker. I say now, truthfully, there's always been a historic, at least in my experience, kind of the anecdotal part of there's always been people who get an X gender marker and then change their mind. They decide they'd like to have a different marker instead. But especially nowadays, there's a lot of reasons someone might not be comfortable using a passport with an X gender marker, and people might decide to do something else instead. So, with all that said, there are risks that can come from using a passport with an X gender marker. Those risks include, so the first big one, and this is also something that changed a couple months ago, and this might be a headline that we've seen. We're going to talk about it a little bit. So the first big risk when traveling internationally with an X gender marker in your passport, the official line is potential discrepancies may lead to extra scrutiny, including additional questioning or security screening by Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection or CBP, which is what I'm going to be calling them. So what does that mean? So CBP is essentially the TSA that you interact with when you are traveling internationally. Prior to October of this year, and I will actually say since 2005, there has been a rule on the books that just hasn't really been enforced. And this rule is that air carriers, commercial airlines that are handling international flights, for international flights, are required to submit information about travelers to CBP as part of travel. This has been going on since 2005. None of this is new. None of this is different. Historically, the only gender markers that you could submit were M or F, meaning male or female. That hasn't really been enforced because airlines don't always only accept M or F, and travel documents don't only have M or F. And so, for a bunch of reasons, there have been exceptions to this rule essentially since 2005. Usually, you could submit an M or an F on someone's behalf from essentially when you book your plane ticket and you fill out your information with the airline, that's where they're getting their information from. Other options can be an X, meaning that kind of undesignated, non-binary option. The other one is just unknown. There was also a U option for carriers where that wasn't reported when they bought the ticket. I don't really know what it is, and then just wasn't reported in general. So this rule has been on the books since 2005. The difference is that it is now being enforced. And so this is a decision by CBP to start enforcing it again, but nothing new has happened other than the way they're choosing to act. So effective October of this year, what this means is they're going back to the system where commercial airlines have to either submit an M or an F on someone's behalf. That is an issue for a bunch of reasons. And the number one reason is if you're someone who has an X gender marker on your passport, you don't have either of those options. And so in that situation, an airline is going to have to figure out what to report for you. And so sometimes this means the airline is going to reach out to you directly and ask what marker they should put down. Sometimes this means the airline might guess. This means that if there's a difference between the marker on your passport and the marker that CBP has, it can lead to additional questioning and security screening. And I also want to emphasize that does not mean you will not be allowed to travel. That means it's going to be annoying when you travel. That means that you can reasonably expect that you will be getting additional questions because there's something from your document to the database that doesn't match. But again, this does not mean you will be prevented from traveling. It means that you will have an annoying conversation with CBP. And for a lot of people, they do not want to have any extra scrutiny. They don't want to go through that experience. And that is completely understandable. The other thing I want to say is with policies like this, it affects transgender people and gender nonconforming people vastly more. It also affects cisgender people a lot. That undesignated or unknown option was important for airlines because it gave them cover when they didn't know someone's answer. And so this situation right now is affecting non-binary and gender non-conforming travelers. It's also affecting cisgender travelers. So I say that to say I'm really curious how this rule is going to go in the future because this is not a small problem. This is a problem for a lot of people. And again, this is not a problem that prevents you from traveling. It's a problem that prevents you from going through CBP smoothly. This is something that is annoying. But I want to emphasize that is what we're talking about. The other big concern, and this one is not new, is that there are some countries that do not recognize the validity of passports with X gender markers. For this, my advice is always research the countries where you're going, make sure they recognize the validity of your passport. But there are some countries Truthfully, a lot of them have extremely low LGBT ratings and are expected to not accept the validity of a passport with an X gender marker. But make sure that you are researching the country that you are going to make sure that you won't have any issues there. Even if it's just a country you're using for a connecting flight, for example, while you're flying internationally, make sure you double check, make sure you look, and make sure that you're going to be safe and allowed in the country that you're traveling to. Okay. One more big thing I want to talk about with X gender markers specifically, because I know I hear about this a lot. At this time, there have been no confirmed reports of any incidents of anyone traveling with an X gender marker on their passport. There has been no reports of anyone being detained. There have been no reports of anyone's travel documents being confiscated. There are no reports of anyone being prevented from traveling because they are using an X gender marker on their passport. There are no reports at this time, as far as I'm aware. My colleagues are aware. The circles that I am in, where I am checking in with other attorneys and other providers, that's not something that we know about. And with that said, same thing as before, there's a lot of reasons someone might not be comfortable anyway using a passport with an X gender marker, and that's okay. The most important thing is to be using the ID you are most comfortable using, given the tools that we have. If that is keeping your passport with its X gender marker, do it. And if that means submitting for renewal, so you get issued back a passport reflecting your sex assigned at birth, that is okay too. There is no right or wrong answer. We are working with the tools that we have. Another thing I'll just throw in, your gender markers do not have to match across documents. It is okay to have, for example, a real ID with an X marker on it and a passport with an F or an M. That is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And vice versa. It's okay if you decide to have a binary marker on your real ID and keep your X on your passport. That is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with having mismatching gender markers. The most important thing is use the ID that you feel most comfortable traveling with the tools that we have available right now. So with that, we are out of passport land. So now we are going to talk about generally how to travel safely while being trans. And same thing I said before, this is going to be also a bit anecdotal. This is going to be topics that come up for me a lot in my conversations with my clients, for anyone who's going through the name change process or going through the process of updating gender markers. So the first big tip is one that truthfully, I'm always really surprised people haven't already heard about. If you are someone who doesn't want to use your passport, get a real ID. Go get a real ID. It's very annoying because you got to go to the DMV and you have to give them all the documents that they need to kind of bump you up to that status of having a real ID. But this also means you can use your real ID to travel domestically. This means you only need your passport if you're going to go internationally, if you're going to travel to other countries. But for within the United States, get a real ID or get a real ID compliant ID or use one that you already have that has your correct gender marker on it. So if you are already on the fence, go get your real ID. I promise it's worth the hassle. So the other big thing to talk about is look out for travel advisories for LGBTQ plus travelers. This applies domestically and it applies internationally. For domestic travel, make sure that you are checking for US travel advisories before you plan any major trips. As a heads up right now, the only advisories that I am aware of are for Florida and Texas. That is based on a few different factors. One of them is the laws for transgender people right now in both of those states are a bit more aggressive and don't require residency as part of them. I say that to say if you are traveling to Texas or Florida, be careful. Make sure you look into those advisories. Make sure you look into the areas that you are going to. And when in doubt, there is nothing wrong. Contact a local attorney. Contact someone in Florida or Texas. A lot of times attorneys will either do free or low-cost consultations and talk about the kinds of questions that you have. There's nothing wrong with getting information before you go and before you plan your trip. The other thing is be aware of local laws that can affect trans and gender nonconforming people, and especially parents. This comes up a bit more in Florida. A lot of those laws I was talking about can affect things like anyone who's seeking gender affirming care or a minor, for example, and that's the reason that you're crossing state lines. Check where you're going. And if in doubt, contact a local attorney. It is always worth it. Have the half-hour conversation, 15-minute conversation. Ask your questions and get some real answers before you go. When it's for international travel, same kind of thing. Check for international travel advisories for transgender, gender nonconforming people. gender nonconforming people. This also goes for LGBTQ plus people in general, but especially for trans people. Check your travel advisories. Make sure you're going somewhere safe before you book your trip, before you plan your flight, before you commit to a connecting flight somewhere. The other big thing, many countries have issued their own advisories for transgender people traveling to the United States. At this time, I don't have any reports of a trans US citizen or permanent resident traveling out of the United States and returning and being denied re-entry into the United States. I also say that knowing that that information can change in the future. It can. But at this time, that hasn't happened. And if I'm being honest, I don't expect it to happen because in a lot of the schemes that we're talking about, that is a different kind of problem than a lot of the problems we're talking about tonight. So when it comes to those advisories, a lot of those have to do with non-US residents or non-permanent residents traveling in and out of the United States, and they might have a difficult time getting entry. When it comes to US citizens and permanent residents, that is different, or at least it looks different. The last thing I'm going to say is stay aware of changing policies for individuals returning to the US, especially for trans people. Everything I said stays. At this time, there are no incidents, there are no reports that I'm aware of. That can change. Make sure if you are able to, check the headlines, check the news, make sure you're keeping yourself updated. And if that is a burden, because it very often is to try to stay updated right now, subscribe to a newsletter that you know will update you. Things like ACLU and Land Illegal, Advocates for Trans Equality, those are fantastic resources. They will send you emails when there is a thing to know. You don't have to sift through homophobic and transphobic headlines to get your information. Subscribe to newsletters that are going to give you that information. If I could also do a plug, Jerner Law Group, we have a newsletter that we send out about monthly now. I write most of the emails. I am very nice. And a lot of those emails are big news updates specific to Pennsylvania and New Jersey at times, and specifically talking about things that our clients ask about and sending out an email because if I have 10 people asking me a question, 100 people probably have that question. So just a plug, subscribe to our email list, learn more about these kinds of things as they pop up. And if nothing else, subscribe to things like the ACLU, Land Illegal, Advocates for Trans Equality. Make sure you don't have to sift through the news yourself if that's not a task you can take on. So with that, the other big thing I want to talk about, and speaking of this, I am absolutely going to plug something. So know your rights when you are going through airport security and TSA. A big thing I want to say just right at the top, I didn't put it in the slide. Advocates for Trans Equality is a fantastic organization, A4TE. They have a lot of Know Your Rights guides on their website. They're very easy to find. They have fantastic guides on passports, which I will admit is a bit outdated right now, given how quickly things are changing. They also have a fantastic reference for airport security. It's where honestly I get most of my updates and my information. Strongly recommend for anyone right now who's feeling anxious about air travel specifically and going through airport security. They walk you through the entire experience of what to expect from airport security. Cannot recommend enough. Advocates for Trans Equality, check out the Know Your Rights guides. With that said, so big things to know. Travelers with mismatching names and gender markers, like we were talking about before, can expect some scrutiny from agents, but that is not going to stop you from traveling. It will be annoying. It will not preclude you from getting where you need to be. Irregularities or anomalies in body scans can result in travelers being pulled out of line for pat downs. I want to talk about this one for a second. So this is a very old problem. This is not a new issue. This has been coming up for years, but I think right now gets a ton more concern, as it should, because of everything going on right now with travel. So when you are going through TSA or BPD and you're getting, we all have that moment, you get into the scanner and they do a full body scan. The way that TSA works, or the way I will just say TSA, I do refer to both. The way that their scanners work is that they are binary. A TSA agent is going to plug in a gender marker for you. It's unrelated to your travel documents. It's unrelated to anything else. It is kind of a judgment call that they have to hit. It tells the scanner what kind of anatomy or shape to look for. So for example, if they plug in female, they're looking for something larger on top, not something larger on bottom, and vice versa. If they see something they weren't expecting, it gets flagged automatically. So this is absolutely an issue for anyone who is using a binder, anyone who is using a packer, anyone who is wearing padding, anyone, wigs, I will say rarely trip up the system. I don't know what it is with hair. Very few alerts because of wigs or hair systems or anything like that, but also a possibility. So if you are someone who is you think you might be presenting differently than what the button they're going to hit for you is, it's reasonable to expect that this is going to happen. You can try to talk to a TSA agent in advance. There's a lot of really helpful tips for this. Either you can ask up front for a pat down instead of going through the scanner, just to cut if you don't want to go through that process. Otherwise, for the pat down itself, it's usually going to be pulled out of line, and an agent's going to do it relatively quickly. It is invasive. It is annoying. It is a burden. Same thing, it does not preclude you from traveling. And it's also just another thing to keep in mind, it's not targeted. This is not an example of transphobia by an agent. This is more often an example of why computers kind of suck sometimes, and why they're not helpful when it comes to these kinds of tasks. So make sure to expect that this will happen, not be surprised by it, because it can be alarming if you didn't expect it coming. The other thing is all travelers have the right to be treated with dignity, discretion, and respect. If you experience an issue with TSA or BPD, be polite, ask for a manager or a supervisor. Don't get aggressive, don't start a fight, ask for a manager. You are entitled to that, you are allowed to do that. It is okay to say you want to talk to someone else, that you need an agent of a different gender, for example, to do a pat down or to ask you questions. Those things are okay. Just make sure that you are being as polite as you can. Make sure that your main goal is get in and get out of security. And so anything you have to do that with dignity, with discretion, and with privacy, we're going to go for it. So the other thing I want to say, and the big theme for tonight, we're talking a lot about worst case scenarios. We're talking about a lot of very scary situations when we're traveling. The majority, the vast majority of trans and gender nonconforming travelers, especially for domestic travel specifically, will not experience any issues. I do not expect you to. And again, anecdotally, I've had a lot of clients that will reach out to me before, while we're in the process of their name change or after, and they're going to travel internationally or domestically and ask me what to expect. I will usually ask them to report back, and the answers when they report back is nothing really happened. But I'm glad I knew what to expect. I'm glad I knew a worst case scenario just in case it did. The vast majority of people will not experience issues. And if you are someone who does experience an issue, it is okay. Take a breath, know your rights, know where you are, know the law, check out the resources that you have, and make sure to be courteous, polite, get out of there as quick as you can. Okay. That is everything I'm going to cover specifically for tonight. So for more information, also shameless plug, if you ever want to contact Jerner Law Group specifically about a question that you have or your specific situation, a bit more specific than we've gotten into tonight, call us, send us an email. That email, it gets routed to all of the attorneys at the firm so we can see your question and someone can answer it as well as we can. Subscribe to our email list. Scroll to the bottom of our website. I even put a little thing that says subscribe to the email list. That is exactly what you'll see. Type in your information. You'll get our email blast when they go out with Pennsylvania updates. Come visit our office. We're pretty cool. We have a very cute office building in Germantown, in Philly. Or if you ever see me at the courthouse, say hi. I always like getting to talk about this stuff. So with all of that said, we're going to talk about questions. And then Robin, I want to know if you had anything that came up while we were talking.
Yeah, we did have a question put in the chat, and so I will read it to you. So someone wrote, I updated my 16-year-old's name on a passport, and the gender was already done over the summer. State Department made us sign an attestation. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but will that hold? She's traveling to Germany in April.
That's a fantastic question. So that is also, I'm not going to go back in the slides. So for the attestation form, that is something I glossed over when we were talking about the Or v. Trump, that temporary relief window that was open. So part of that temporary relief is something a lot of people did use. In order to show that you were qualified as a class member, that you were someone who was eligible for that updated passport, the State Department asked everyone to sign attestation forms, which essentially was saying, I am someone who qualifies as a class member, and that's why I get an exception to the policy. So those attestation forms were routine. They went to the State Department, and that's how people were able to get their passports back. So the trickier part of that conversation is the general rule is a passport that is validly issued is valid until it expires. That is the history of passports. That is how passports work. There are very specific reasons someone can invalidate a US passport. They are not easy to do. Invalidating a US passport is things like being convicted of terrorism, having a specific kind of minor sexual offense on your record, being a flight risk of someone who's being prosecuted for terrorism. These are not things that are done very casually. These are the kinds of things you will definitely know if they're happening to you, and this is something that will get talked about. The State Department likes to intimidate people out of using the documents that they are lawfully given, that are theirs, that are valid until they expire. So there has been some back and forth. The State Department has been updating its website. I know there's been some headlines covering it about the State Department saying it would seek to invalidate passports that were issued during this temporary window where people signed attestation forms showing that they qualified as a class member, that they would use those to try to seek out passports to invalidate. There are several issues with this. Mostly, that's not how this works. And truly, I think there's two big chunks here. And to actually answer the question of what do I think is going to happen? I don't know. I know what has historically happened. And what has historically happened is it is extremely difficult to invalidate someone's passport for something that is not one of these extremely serious reasons. That is not a project the State Department has taken on before. And it is unclear if they're actually going to take it on, which gets me to the second piece of a lot of the headlines and the rhetoric and the misinformation that gets spread about travel documents, and especially about passports, is meant to intimidate. It is meant to make people afraid of using passports with an X gender marker or passports that reflect someone's correct gender marker. And so I don't know what is going to happen. What I can say is this is a pattern we've seen before of the State Department taking a bigger step than it will actually take in a way to convince people of something that hasn't actually happened. So there is always a chance I'm wrong. There is a chance that they will decide to do a massive undertaking that has never been seen before and invalidate a lot of people's passports through a process that is extremely onerous and difficult and entitles you to a hearing and due process. There is a lot of hoops that get jumped through. Maybe they'll prove me wrong and do it. In my own opinion, I'm not so sure. And so I am very excited for her to travel in April. I would reasonably expect there's not a concern with her passport. And the other thing is, if there is a concern with her passport, you will know. This is the kind of thing people find out about. We will be finding out about it quickly. And the fact that we haven't also tells me something. And if that is something that happens, if anyone who is watching this or listening to this has a reason to be concerned about the validity of their passport, give me a call, send me an email, contact Jerner Law Group. We can always talk about it more specifically about your situation. But on the whole, I'm not particularly worried. I'm angry, if that's a good answer. So with that said, I will get off my soapbox. Are there any other questions? Anything else that anyone wants to talk about?
The presentation was so thorough that it knocked out my questions,
That I get that a lot.
which is honestly awesome because I was like, wow, this is really detailed. Yeah. I had
Yeah.
like not even thought about I was so frustrated when I was like, because in my head I was like, they can't get me because I changed all my stuff. I never had a passport I before I updated my gender marker. But I remember, but
Yeah.
hearing you talk, I had to do that selective service thing. So, um,
We don't have time for the TED talk I would like to give about selective service. That is a different issue, but they very sneaky, very insidious is like the best way to put it of
yeah,
they are checking with each other. And like same thing I said before, the fact that they have the information isn't the scary part because a lot of people, a lot of what I hear nowadays is fear about the information they have. The information is not the scary part. If I have to be honest, the scary part is the way federal agencies talk to each other. The other thing I'm also going to say, in case this is a question that people have, because I do get this question a lot, federal agencies can talk to each other pretty freely. They historically haven't. It's a new development because truthfully, federal agencies are just kind of bad at it. They don't really have the chains of communication that you think that they do, and they're creating them in real time. So they're kind of getting that up and running. Communication between federal agencies and state agencies, not the same. Not the same, not the same. And so a lot of people will say, well, can't they go contact Pennsylvania Vital Records about my birth certificate? Not in the same way. They can try. Pennsylvania Vital Records has a ton of reasons they don't give that information over, even to the federal government. So federal level is all relatively evil, even. They will talk to each other. I am so sorry. Uh, well, they will talk to each other on an even level. State agencies, not the same thing, and very difficult to create that kind of channel of communication where they can just have access to things. Doesn't exist, would be very difficult to make, and not a thing I think they could reasonably make in the next 3 years. So that is a different kind of problem. But
That's good. Good to know. I see in the chat someone asked, should we get TSA pre-check or something else to help going through security?
yeah, so that's absolutely an option. A few pros and cons to that. So there are definitely people who use TSA PreCheck also as a way of avoiding a lot of the discomfort that comes from going through the security screening. The other
Mhm.
caveat I will say is TSA PreCheck, and this is my understanding. I don't know, I haven't done quite a deep dive in the same way. TSA PreCheck, Global Entry, those kinds of programs will also ask for your gender or your sex assigned at birth. They are subject to similar federal regulation as passports. And that's also where I come back to make sure you answer the question that's being asked. Make sure if they're asking for your gender, you can answer honestly. If they ask for your sex assigned at birth, answer honestly. And so the biggest caveat there is absolutely go for it for TSA PreCheck as long as that is more helpful than it is hurtful. There's not a ton of situations where I can think of it being hurtful, but just make sure you're doing the best option for you. Make sure you check the form that you're going to fill out as part of it. Make sure you're comfortable filling it out. That's really the biggest tips.
That's really helpful. Do you know of any cases, like, I'm just thinking now out
Yeah.
loud, of like, so I'm a trans person and I'm also an intersex person. Um, have you seen any cases of like, I guess I start to get curious about the like assigned gender at birth stuff, if
Yes.
it's like a questionable territory. I mean,
Yeah.
my assumption is that they just pick one, but I'm curious if there's been any cases where people have had to figure that out.
100%. So I'm going to be a nerd for a minute. So there was a lawsuit 2020, 2021 when we initially got X gender markers on passports the first time.
Hmm.
The named plaintiff in that case was a non-binary person, but another huge argument in that case, one of the big pushes was this is an option that we need for intersex people who can't choose one of the other options because it's physically, biologically, personally, not really an acceptable option for anybody. And so that was a huge part of the importance for X gender markers. Now, I believe I might be mistaken, one of the plaintiffs is intersex, and that is
Hmm.
also part of the arguments that are being raised. The focus is usually more on non-binary and gender non-conforming people for the importance of the marker. I think just I really hope they talk more about the need for intersex people because the people don't talk enough about how X markers are non-binary slash undesignated. The undesignated is an important piece for a bunch of people. Anyone who doesn't want to opt into the binary options. Also, anyone who just straight up doesn't want to report their gender on their documents. It's kind of weird that we have to do that. It's just kind of weird. I don't really like that we have to do that, period. And so for a lot of people, having X is a way out of that system. And so intersex people, especially where there is no correct option, give me undesignated. And so for a lot of, I'm so sorry, as this is going on, I'm getting a little more unhinged. And so as those arguments are being made, it's coming up. It's not quite at the forefront. I'm hoping it gets more at the forefront. So we have to wait and see.
I appreciate that. That's definitely really interesting. I am so grateful for all of your insight and all of your time. I'll ask just everybody who's out there if there's any more questions. Um, and you said that it would be okay if people reach out to you following up. So people who have joined this, if they reach out to you about like a follow-up. Correct, Rachel?
Yeah. So I am, for anyone who's with us live, I
Great, I
don't
see.
know. No one else can see that. Hold on, I will fix that.
Oh,
I
you
said
sent it to
that.
me.
I said that only to Robin.
It's
My
all good.
apology. That is my email for anyone who's watching live. If you have a more specific question, you think it might be helpful to talk to a lawyer more specifically about your situation, send me an email, give me a call. We can always have a talk about it. More often than not, a lot of those conversations, you don't quite need a lawyer, you just kind of needed an answer. There are absolutely situations where getting a lawyer involved is helpful. We can always talk about it. But especially for stuff like this, the most important advice, especially to end on, there is a ton of misinformation that is going around. That misinformation can happen maliciously. It happens from the Trump administration and the State Department. It also happens accidentally. It happens because you hear a story and you want to make sure that the community stays informed. You want to make
Yeah.
sure that you're telling your friends and your loved ones what's going on. The biggest thing I can say is fact check, make sure that you are grounded and you are focusing on what's really happening. A ton of what's going on is preemptive compliance with a policy that doesn't exist. Same kind of thing as the passports that were issued during that temporary relief. Same thing as people who have X's on their passports now that are valid passports that they are allowed to use. We do not need to let intimidation change the decisions that we make or push us into different decisions. Make sure, check your information, check your sources, and when in doubt, check with someone. Go find a reputable place. Check ACLU, Lambda Legal, Advocates for Trans Equality. Check all those places, see what they are saying, because that is information we can go off of. So, officially getting off of my soapbox, but any other questions, anything anyone else is thinking, throw them in the chat.
Been a good soapbox. You never have to get off of that here.
That I I love my job. My job, especially nowadays, this is a very rough time to be a trans person and
For
to be
sure.
helping trans people. And I am very, very honored every day that I get to do this because if I'm having a bad day, someone else is having a worse day. And it's very nice to know when I'm having a good day, someone's having a better day. And I will take that with me. But this was a lovely conversation. Thank you very much for letting me run my mouth about passports and travel documents for a while. This was lovely.
Of course. Um, oh, I see one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. I see, do you have any specific concerns about travel to Florida?
So, yes and no. So, this also gets back into the misinformation, check your sources. And that's also why a lot of what I say is go check and see what the travel advisories say. I know there are organizations putting out the advisories that have more full context. A lot of Florida specifically, the biggest concern is specifically anyone who is traveling in or out of Florida with a transgender child or minor as part of, I'm so sorry because you all just saw it. This is my little fidget I've been playing with this whole time because you just saw my thumb, so you all get it for free. The law is specifically for anyone traveling with a transgender minor who is entering the state of Florida as part of getting gender affirming care or trying to leave the state of Florida to access gender affirming care. That is a much more complicated situation than we can talk about. It has a lot to do with the way that Florida's child custody laws are set up, and the way that their child endangerment laws are set up, and is very different than any model that we have here. For context, in Pennsylvania, there's legislation pending right now to ban any kind of law like that in the future, and to say that you cannot criminalize someone for, you can't consider it child abuse for someone to get gender affirming care for their child. So we have a very different system in other states. Every state is different. That's one of the main things for Florida is if you are a parent traveling with a trans kid, check. That is definitely a situation. Contact a local attorney, check the ordinances, check the advisories, get a sense of what it looks like before you are traveling in or out of the state. That's kind of biggest advice. All right. The last call. Any other questions? Anything else we can think of?
You
Oh,
see some folks saying thankful in the chat.
and thank you very much.
Well, have a lovely night, everybody. And just like Rachel said that you can reach out to her, you're also welcome to reach out to Eastern PA Trans Equity Project if you're just looking for help to connect to another resource. Um, all the things that she listed were also great too. But I hope that you all have a really lovely night
100%.
and take care. Stay warm out there. It's cold.
Have a good one, everybody.
Bye.